All right, good morning, class.
Morning.
Back to our AP Japanese history. As I mentioned in our first class, I am going to be using more internet sources because those are things that you can actually have access to. It's a very difficult thing to study Japanese history when you're not part of an actual university institution. You don't have the access, and you don't have the translated access because I don't think any of you speak Japanese. One of you, one of you definitely does. But, so what we're going to start with is Japan before the period we're mostly going to be talking about, which is the periods of Japanese history that we actually have contemporary sources about, that people were actually writing about as it happened. So before that, we have, well, right now we have pre-history. Because the thing about history is that it encompasses a great many fields, and one of those fields is archaeology. Writing is, in different places, writing can be a very recent invention, so we often have to rely on things like archaeology and on anthropology to get an understanding of what the history of a place is. And that also introduces some of our issues in studying history, which is going to be a recurring theme here as we talk about Japanese history in particular. Namely in the fact that, again, most of us here don't speak Japanese. Most of us here do not have easy access to Japan. And thus, we don't really have access to the primary sources in Japan, which are the actual records, the actual artifacts. We have to get it third-hand, really, because someone else has to translate it into English and then make it available to us. And one of those problems you get is stuff like this Japan's early Paleolithic fabrication scandal, where Fujimura Shinichi, it was for several decades considered one of the foremost in the field of studying Paleolithic Japan, even though he was an amateur archaeologist. In fact, he was called the Hand of God because he seemed to have an incredible knack for discovering new artifacts that painted Japanese civilization as being far, far older than anyone ever suspected it was, of being more advanced than anyone suspected it was. And as the word hoax up there, probably how fabrication right there might tell you, pretty much all of it was faked. He was actually taking later artifacts and seeding them, planting them in his dig sites. And when it was found he was doing that, people started asking some hard questions about how did it take so many decades for anyone not even just to realize this, but to even question it. Because normal scientific rigor is that you're going to examine this very carefully, but a lot of the academic and museum institutions in Japan just didn't look quite as closely as their professional standards usually demand they do. And so we have situations like this where for decades we were getting this picture of Japan that we found out in 2000, in the year 2000, had been false for so long. And so you get this understanding that the sources become problematic because we can't engage with them in the way that we would like, and we have to trust other people to engage with them with the rigor that our field demands. So here's one of the main sources that you are going to consult throughout this class. It's not necessarily going to be like, it's not going to be required reading or anything, but when you want to refresh yourself about certain aspects of Japanese religious beliefs, particularly Shinto, which will crop up repeatedly because it is one of the major religions of Japan, obviously, and the native religion of Japan, actually, since Buddhism is a later import, will have this translated encyclopedia of Shinto concepts and terms that will just make this a lot easier because it will allow you to refresh yourself on the things that we cover. But another thing we're going to talk about with the sources is who wrote this? Does anyone maybe have any ideas on who might have set this up? Who translated it? It is on the page.
University?
Yeah.
Gakuin University.
Yes, that
Apologize
is
if I butchered that.
Kokugakuin University,
There we go.
which is, are any of you familiar with Kokugakuin University? Do any of you maybe know what kind of reputation it has in this particular field? Or how credible a source you might find it? Like, is this Harvard, or is this some little community college or state university? Well, when you find that, you can look up its site, because pretty much all of them do. Every university has a website nowadays, and this one has an English version.
Oh.
Although this is not English, but this is. And you'll see the little sales pitch here. You can read this at your leisure, but you scroll down, you see where their campuses are. Shibuya is one of the major neighborhoods in Tokyo. So so this obviously isn't some little state university. This is in the middle, smack in the middle of Tokyo. And you can see financial statements, the founding philosophy, history, messages, etc. Disclosure information, education and research objectives. You could look over all this at your leisure, and I advise you to do that when you want to be rigorous about finding out, well, what perspective is this being written from? Who is doing the writing on this? But since our time is limited, we will indulge in something I expect you not to do when you are researching for papers, except to mine for actual sources that you can use. And there we go. Kokugakuin University is a private university, and for obvious reasons, I'm not going to say that it is a bad thing for this to be a private university. That is not a red flag here. The academic program and research of Shinto study, Japanese history, Japanese and Chinese literature, and culture study are highly evaluated in and out of Japan. But, what does that say right there?
Citation.
Which means that this could easily be someone from Kokugakuin University saying that they are very highly respected and highly rated in and out of Japan, which is the danger of Wikipedia. Always check the citation. Established in 1882, well, that comes from the website itself, so that's probably correct. I don't think Kokugakuin University is going to pretend that it was founded in 1882. That would be very easy to look up. Let's see. So we see where the little short history of it. We see this. Education research. At Kokugakuin, one can take a course to obtain the qualifications to become a kannushi, Shinto priest. A course where one can get these qualifications exists only at Kokugakuin University and Kogakuin University. So there's the there's the background we're getting here. Most likely, the people who have written this encyclopedia for your edification and education are people who are studying or have studied at Kokugakuin to become Shinto priests. So, could any of you use that information that you now have about the people who probably made this to guess how that might influence the way the information is presented?
Well, they're gonna read about the religion in a positive light, possibly. Maybe less critical.
John, you have anything to add to that?
They probably have a good knowledge of what they're talking about, I would say, if that's one of their like specific specialties at that university. But I do agree with Chris. I think that might mean that things aren't always presented in like an unbiased maybe way. They're presented in a very like, oh, we have an opinion, so there'll be a slant. It won't necessarily be like objective.
All right, that's good. You've actually both covered some of the main things you might get from that. Is that because it's not necessarily a bad thing that the people writing this are Shinto priests,
Yeah.
because, well, who's better qualified to write about the religion than the person who went to college to be a priest in that religion and teach it to people? On the other hand, these are people who their job is essentially to sell this. I mean, not sell, but these are people who are invested in this. Maybe if you're coming at this from the perspective of wanting to examine these beliefs with a clinical rigor, you might have to read between the lines a bit. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind when you look into religious teachings in general. And especially ones that can only be accredited at 2 specific universities. Because that means that is very much the Orthodox. This is kind of a Shinto Vatican, really.
Shinto Vatican.
Now, one of the main reasons that we're studying Japanese history in particular is not only because California has a lot of Japanese people that come to it, especially if you ever go to UCLA, but also because that is Japan's roots, Japan's history, is one that very, very much affects Japan's relationships today, especially with Korea and China. And I'm pretty sure both of you are very well aware that that is not an insignificant topic in today's world. And this here is from an issue of Discover magazine, which is mostly a science magazine, but it does have things about archaeology, human origins, history. This is from the June 1998 issue, so it's almost 20 years old, but still relevant. Essentially what it's going to say is a lot of things about the self-image of Japan, because Japan's self-image is still very heavily invested in its history. Like a lot of countries that you find in the Sinosphere, the countries that have been influenced heavily by China, Japan kind of has a very kind of push-pull relationship with its historical relations with other countries, especially with China and also with Korea, because it's kind of like a very dysfunctional family, where one minute Japan loves China and wants to be China, and the next minute Japan's invading China. So we have 4 opposing, conflicting theories for the origin of the Japanese people. And that alone can tell you how rigorously debated this can get, most popular in Japan, and you'll note that he'll note this quite a lot, is the view that the Japanese people gradually evolved from ancient Ice Age people who occupied Japan long before 20,000 BC. And remember, this was before Fujimura Shinichi's hoax was revealed, and Japan was revealed to be probably a lot younger than had previously been the consensus in Japan. So you have that. Also widespread in Japan is a theory that the Japanese descended from horse-riding Asian nomads who passed through Korea to conquer Japan in the 4th century, but who were themselves emphatically not Koreans. A theory favored by many Western archaeologists and Koreans, and unpopular in some circles in Japan, is that the Japanese are descendants of immigrants from Korea who arrived with rice paddy agriculture around 400 BC. Finally, the 4th theory holds that the peoples named in the other 3 theories could have mixed to form the modern Japanese. So why might those first 2 theories be the most popular in Japan itself? And why might they be a little on the latter 2?
The first 2 are more of a distinct people that are separating and finding their own identity that is just separate from Koreans or others.
Yeah, you have, when similar questions of origins arise about other peoples, they can be discussed dispassionately. That is not so for the Japanese. Sean, can you read to until 1946?
Yes. Do you want me to read from until 1946?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll tell you. Stop at 660.
Okay, wonderful. Until 1946, Japanese schools taught a myth of history based on the earliest recorded Japanese chronicles, which were written in the 8th century. They described how the sun goddess Amaterasu, born from the left eye of the crater god Izanagi, sent her grandson Ninigi to Earth on the Japanese island of Kyushu to wed an earthly deity. Ninigi's great-grandson Jimmu, aided by a dazzling sacred bird that rendered his enemies helpless, became the first emperor of Japan in 660 BC.
And then to fill the gap between 660 BC and the earliest historically documented Japanese monarchs, the chronicles invented 13 other equally fictitious emperors. You will still find in official histories of Japan, in genealogies of the Japanese imperial family, those almost certainly fictitious emperors are still on there with reigns of like 200 years or so.
Interesting.
And you will still see the relation of that Shinto creation myth, that of the divinity of the imperial family. Because even though after the end of World War II, the Emperor of Japan renounced his claims of divinity, to a lot of Japanese people he's still someone you don't really say isn't divine. And here you have, unlike American archaeologists who acknowledge that ancient sites in the United States were left by peoples, Native Americans, unrelated to most modern Americans, for obvious reasons, because we came here well after we had very established writing. So let's not go too crazy with stroking our ego on that one. Unrelated to most modern Americans, Japanese archaeologists believe all archaeological deposits in Japan, no matter how old, were left by ancestors of the modern Japanese, and that ties squarely into their creation myth, which is meant to kind of give that impression of an unbroken, long chain, because one of the key things we'll be coming to in Japanese history is that, like Imperial China, like pre-modern Korea, that weight of tradition, that weight of history behind you grants a lot of power and prestige, and is a very important recurring role in Japanese history, the weight of tradition asserting itself. So that's kind of some of the pre-historical records that we actually have access to. There are actually mentions of Japan in Chinese records as early back as the early Han Dynasty in the first few centuries BC. In fact, there is in the Fukuoka Museum a gold seal given by Emperor Guangwu in 57 AD to the king of a state called Na, which was found in Fukuoka. It was dug up in about the 1500s.
No.
And
Wow, that's interesting.
actually, the name that you will find in the Chinese records for Japan is obviously not Japan. They call it Wo, but in Japanese sources, because they read Chinese characters differently, they use it to fit their own language, it will be called Wa. And the thing about that name is that it means dwarf or midget. So when pirates become a very big issue with China, and they mostly blame Japan, even though early on yes, but later on a lot of them are Chinese, and that's going to be a big diplomatic issue. You will find them calling them woko, or dwarf pirates is actually what that means, even though they mean Japanese pirates. So next class we'll go over some of the early importations of Korean and Chinese culture, and how there are very mixed interpretations of what forms those exchanges took. And of course it will often be divided between Japan thinking one thing, Korea and the West sometimes thinking something very different.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, okay.